We have Samuel who married Elizabeth, who married Samuel Gann, and the generally accepted date for his birth is 1702 to 03. And I can tell you that he was born in Richmond County, Virginia, because that is where Elizabeth Dodson lived. He died sometime before 1762 in Frederick County, Virginia. Elizabeth died after 1762, either in Virginia or North Carolina. I'm going to show you the research I have that points back to John Gann being a son of Samuel Gann, and that John Gann lived between 1675, he was born between 1675 and 1681, and why I believe that's his probable birth years, and that he married a Miss or a Mrs. Bird. And Bird is a big name in Virginia if you've done Virginia research. This is a court record book from the 3rd day of February, 1703. On the right-facing page, we have John Gann. On the left-facing page, we have Charles Dodson, Jr. This record places John Gann in the same county at the same time as Elizabeth's oldest brother. Do you remember last hour I asked you to remember the firstborn son, Charles Dodson, Jr.? These are unrelated court cases, but here they are. So we know that there was a John Gann in Richmond at exactly the same time as the Dodsons were there. I just told you what this says at the top. The record shows that John Gann was in the same county at the same time as the Dodsons, whose DNA we carry. The year 1703 is exactly the same year that Samuel Gann is generally thought to have been born, and that is the date on this court record. This record shows that John Gann is involved in the matter between Thomas Wally and John Berg. We don't get much information from this record. The transcription says, upon the attachment granted to Thomas Wally against John Berg, ordered that John Gann be summoned by the sheriff of this county or his deputy to appear at the next court and render an amount or an account. I can't tell if it's amount or account. What or how much he stands indebted to the said John Berg. So Thomas Wally holds an attachment, which is basically a lien against John Berg's property that is now in John Gann's hands. John Berg died 1702 by the early February 1703 date of this entry and Thomas Wally going to report. Let's go further. Here is the next year. It took 14 months for John Gann to appear at the next session of court. And this is your reading test. No laughs? Okay, this is your reading test. But aren't old records fun to transcribe? But we have to know what they look like, what the records say. This particular clerk liked to make backward E's. So the fourth word here looks like bow-tween with an E at the end. But it is in the attachment between Thomas Wally. Let me get to a real. And this, by the way, this court record is the 5th day of April, 1704. In the attachment between Thomas Wally, plaintiff, and John Berg, defendant, the said attachment being returned, levied on the death of the said John Berg in the hands of John Gann, and the said Gann making oath that the debts, that is, what was owed to Berg's estate, that he had in his hand was not sufficient to to satisfy a bill passed by the said John Bird to him, the said John Gann, at the time of the levying the said attachment due upon Bird's death. This court, here's the judgment, this court are of opinion, and here's the thorn, the Y-E, takes us back to those original records. This clerk used the thorn here. It was already out of date by that time. But the same is not sufficient bar against the said attachment, and judgment is granted to the said Thomas Wally against the estate of the said John Bird in the hand of the said John Gann for £4, 8 shillings, and 7 pence, which the court have ordered to pay with cost of suit and etc. So John Gann has to pay a debt that he didn't even create, but this property is passed into his hands. So he's got to fulfill that debt, because that debt came due upon the death of Thomas Wally, because estates are settled after the death of a person and debts are paid. Debts that are owed to the state are billed out to come in as receivables, and the outgoing debts are to be paid out. So how did John Bird's estate and debts pass into the hands of John Gann? Well, he inherited the debt. The bill, the amount owed to Wally, was passed by the said John Bird to him, John Gann. People inherit estates, right? Either as bequest or intestate cases through descent. But in colonial times, there was another type of inheritance, and that was through marriage and what's the law called the law of coverture. And that's what is implied by this passed into his hands. John married either a Miss or Mrs. Bird. And John Bird's estate passed into his hands. He could have married, if she was a Miss, she would have had to have been an only child and a daughter. There were no other heirs at law who could be in contest for this estate. But widows were far more plentiful than only daughters. So there's a great likelihood that Samuel married a widow. Now, when we use the word widow, we always think of old ladies, right? There were teenage widows in that day, and they were not uncommon. I have a great aunt who was widowed at 19. Realistically, she was probably a little bit older than that. But the one thing we know for sure is she had to be young enough to give birth to our Samuel Gann. And Samuel would have been born in exactly the time period of these two court records. So here is poor John. He inherits a debt that he didn't create for himself, but he's got to pay that £4. And £4 were not easy to come by in that day. We don't know how he did it, but he did it, I'm sure. So there's the teeter. Now you see up here I have John Gann, the immigrant, right? And this is immigrant from, not immigrant to, because there's an E and I difference. But I believe John was a John Gann who was born in Kent, England. And I believe he is our immigrant ancestor. I've mentioned this, that he inherited this debt, most likely by coverture, by right of life. He inherited the property, but he also inherited the debt. Now, the Question we want to ask now as researchers is John Gann of Richmond the same person as immigrant John Gann, transport of Captain Francis Epps, Mr. William Epps, and Littlebury Epps, arriving at the Upper James River on the ship Nicholson in 1700? I don't know why I have this slide here. We'll go to the next slide. Okay. Here is the patent. This is a patent, a land patent for 1,000 acres of the Blackwater Swamp in Charles City County, Virginia, to Captain Francis Epps, Mr. William Epps, and Littlebury Epps for transporting 20 people to Virginia. John Gann, right here in yellow, was one of those transports. The Epps lived straddling, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, is it Henrico County? Is that how they pronounce it in Virginia? Henrico?
Yes, yes.
That's what I thought. I looked it up, but I see Henrico, I don't know. But anyway, they lived straddling Henrico County and Charles City County. And they were prominent people with political appointments. They had moved from Ashford, a village in Kent County, England, to Virginia by 1624. That was 75 years before John Gann immigrated. Ashford was not far from villages in Kent where the Ganns, who are DNA related to us, lived. This is a slice of that record, and I'm going to come back to this later and talk about this right here. But I want to show you that every clue in a record is important, and if you just find a familiar name and go with that, you're going to miss the whole story, because you need to research all of this other stuff too. So the people who received the patent, the Epps, they needed to be researched. The other people who received patents on the 24th day of October, 1701, needed to be researched. The ship Nicholson needed to be researched, including what these abbreviations mean here. And this means French frigate Nicholson. And I needed to find out who E. Jennings was. E. Jennings became governor of Virginia in 1706 to 1710. He was a thorough man. We have the ship here. We have the dates. 24th day of October, 1701 was not the arrival date of these 20 persons. And the Epps transported these persons free in exchange for their head right of 50 acres each. That's how they got the 1,000 acres patent in the Blackwater Swamp. So by the time this made it to the Patent Record Office, which would have been in Williamsburg because the capital had moved from Jamestown, John Gann had already been in Virginia from just about the summer of 1700 from the records that I have found. And this ship here has a really interesting story, so I'd like to get to that too. But what I most want to get to is give you the big picture here first. Thank you. What I most want to get to is the big picture here, and then I'll go back and show you the sources. This is Kent, England here. It's southeast of London, is where it is located. The Epps ancestral village, and they maintained contact with their family in Kent. They have good biography because they were a prominent family in Virginia and they were a prominent family in their own home village in Ashford. They lived here. This outline, and David shot me this map. He's kind of our map person. and I told him I was going to be using it, but I adapted it to, I didn't really plagiarize him. I adapted this to my coastline. This is an area where early Ganns are known to live, these villages here. And there are two villages with the same name. It looks like Goodnessstone, but they pronounce it Gunston. Gunston. And this over here is Gunston by Sandwich. And that's how people in England identify the two different towns. So the Ashford group of Epps, they lived 24 miles from this Gunston, but that's because they had to travel this road around this way. Okay? As the crow flies, it's a shorter distance. Here's Dover down here. We know the White Cliffs of Dover, right? The importance in World War II, all those sorts of things. But here we have villages of Faversham, Gunston, all of these towns. In 2004, Joy Gann Brown did a 12-marker test on Robert Gann of England, who at that time lived in Croydon. I have kept the name Croydon so I can keep him pinpointed in case there were any other Robert Ganns who Y-DNA tested. I extended that Y12 test to a big Y sometime after 2019. And I also tested him at Family Finder, and I tested him in Ancestry because I wanted him in the world's largest database of DNA testers. So Robert lived here, but he was born and grew up in Whitstable, one of those coastal towns that I just showed you on the previous slide. Here's Canterbury, famous Canterbury, right? Here's Ashford. Here's Gunston. Robert Gann's family, primarily his son is the one who does research, has traced their family back to Gunston by Sandwich.
Show us Sandwich one more time.
Sandwich, here's Sandwich right here.
Okay, thank you.
And it's Gunston by Sandwich. And that's how the English call it.
The other one's Gunston by Aylesford.
Yeah, right. They distinguish. I can't even imagine living in a place. I live in Rosebud, Arkansas, and postmasters used to send mail to Rosebud, Texas. You know, that's two different states, so I can't even imagine living in the same county. Anyway, Robert's family didn't get far from their roots, did they? They've been there for hundreds of years. Deptford at the top, and this is important. It's a village on the Thames River that runs through London. Deptford Dockyard was King Henry VIII's shipyard. At one time, it was 6 miles from the heart of London, but today it's within the metropolitan area. A historic church at the dockyard is Trinity-St. Clement's. St. Clement is the patron saint of sailors. Canterbury is the seat of the evangelization of Christianity in England. Until Henry VIII's Reformation of the late 1500s, when he wanted a divorce and couldn't obtain one. Canterbury is where the Roman Church established itself. Now, we have wondered for years about the Catholic-leaning names, Ignatius and Clement, and the family, and just what did they mean for us? Because by and large, we're not really a Catholic family, and we've not found Catholic roots in our family. Up here at Deptford, Joseph Mundy, the captain of the ship Nicholson, on which John Gann sailed to Virginia in 1700, was a legal resident of Deptford, which was administratively at that time in Kent County with jurisdiction in Canterbury. Captain Mundy died on the ship in Virginia. His widow had to get papers from Prerogative Court. She was in Virginia, but she had to send all that back by ship to get administration of his estate in their legal residence in Kent County. So what we have here is kind of a trifecta. We have the Epps with long-standing ties to Ashford, who owned a ship. They owned the Nicholson, on which John Gann sailed to Virginia. And the ship captain they had for their ship was from Deptford. He was a Kent man too. And we had all of those Ganns in all of these villages, all the way down here. And we had Robert Gann's family at Gunston by Sandwich. Let's look at Y-DNA. I don't want to talk over your heads if you don't work with Y-DNA, but I do need to point out something. Y-DNA tests only the male sex chromosome that is passed from father to son to son to son. Here's Robert of England over here on the right, Robert Gann of Kent, and here are our American Gann men in these three columns right here. Here's old Nathan, here's old Adam, and he crosses into two columns here because DNA, Y-DNA, mutates over time. New SNPs change and old SNPs change into new SNPs. That's why they're valuable for going back in time as well. So we have, here's Bill Gann and Tom Gann. They both descend from Nathan, 1759. They're in this column. Here's Charlie right over here, he's in this column. Here's Dan over here in this column. Here's a descendant of John Steadfast in this column here. And there's a green column here. This guy is the guy that I found was a DNA match to Roberta Estes in 2016. He's a Clement descendant. So here is Clement in this column. Now, this is the column, this line here, this blue bar here, is going to be Samuel. We know that for sure because that is the bar that unites these three columns. So his father, John, was either the second SNP here, or he was right up here, one of the two. Y-DNA has a mutation rate of about 83 years. So he could be in either place. So let's return to this. This chart I showed you earlier, but I've grayed them out because I want you to concentrate on this. Do you remember I said that my cage again had a special inheritance bond with his father William that goes all the way back to England Gann DNA? Because he's a single line differential. Here is Robert Gann of England. And these are his Gann DNA matches. Now, not that many people in England do DNA testing like we do here in the United States. So we expect him to have far fewer matches. But when I put in a search in Ancestry DNA, because I tested him a few years ago, and I put in a search for people with Gann in their trees, I got this long list. In this group right here, this red group, these pick up American Ganns because autosomal DNA can last for 10, 12, 15 generations, and it can actually last much longer than that. There is such a thing as archaic DNA that goes back to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. I've enlarged it on this side. Tanya Tennyson up here, and I did inform her I was using her DNA in this. She's a descendant of my cage again, and she matches Robert Gann in England, whose family were from Gunston by Sandwich, less than 24 miles as the crow flies from Ashford, where the Epps lived, who owned the ship, the Nicholson, who hired the ship captain, Joseph Monday, to captain the ship to sail to America in 1700. These are additional matches. She shares 15 centimorgans weighted, Ancestry does that, and 18 centimorgans unweighted. That's a good match. That's a really good match for that amount of distance. The next two matches to Robert are England Ganns, and they actually share less because once you get this far back, the way autosomal DNA gets chopped up as it gets passed down successive generations, you just don't know what size the segments are going to be. So they actually share less than Tanya Tennyson, who descends from Micajah Gann in Clark County, Georgia. Come on down to Melody Crane Borger. She descends from old Adam and his second wife, Kristen, through Hannah Gann, who married Moses Nelson. So we've got an old Adam descendant here who matches Robert Gann of England. Come down another one to Colson Pride, and I don't know, I've skipped one. I'm sorry, Miranda 925 is the one who descends from Hannah. My screen's smaller than yours, and it's difficult to see. She descends from old Adam. The next tester, Melody Crane Borger, descends from Nathan Jr., who was also a son of old Adam by Jane, his wife. And so, and he went to Georgia, by the way, Nathan Jr. did. So that's something we have to keep in mind, too, about Tennessee and Georgia Ganns. He married Priscilla. We come down to Colson Pride, and I don't really have a clue who his ancestor is. His tree ended with, I believe it was a Mary Gann in 1832 who married a boatwright. And it's not in the registry, so I don't know, but I can tell who the matches are because I have access to the kids. The matches, this Colson Pride matches David Elijah Gann, who is a descendant not only of William and Dolly Gann, but also a descendant of Samuel and Mary Hambrick. So we get Tennessee Gann, old Adam, and old Adam, and potentially two Georgia Ganns from old Nathan, matching Robert Gann of England, who had ancestry stretching back to 1700 in Kent, England. Now, I'm presuming that this tree is correct, and David M. Gann can kind of weigh in on this next session here. But this is the tree that is attached to Robert's DNA. And they know that they were in Kent in 1723 because Daniel Gann, which also happens to be one of our American names in Washington County, died there in 1723. They can't quite get a whole lot of information here. This John Gann was born about 1670 in Essex. And Essex, or they think in Essex. Essex is right next door to Kent. They're neighbors. They're neighbors. They just cross the county line and so on. If the birth year is correct, 1670, this could not be our John Gann, our American John Gann. The father of this John, who is unknown, would not have had two sons named John, realistically. He would not have. So the common ancestor, again, presuming that this tree is correct, had at least two sons. One is Robert Gann's ancestor. The other son is the ancestor of us, is our line. We would connect right here at this common ancestor. Whether there are records in Kent that could tell us that name, I don't know. I don't know, but I can give you this amount of information where the connection most probably occurs and when it occurs. Remember I said I believe John Gann was born between 1675 and 1681. That's because that's a common age for young single men to have migrated to America by themselves. He arrived as a single man, he wasn't married. So I'm presuming that that's his birthday. It also puts him in the right age group to have married once he got here and to have had Samuel as his probable first son because of that 1703 record that corresponds to the year that we believe Samuel was born. So we might want to look for a Samuel up in here. This John would have been a first cousin to our John. Now look at the way the name John. Adam and Jane had a son named John, their first child, one we call John Steadfast. It's named for the grandfather, Samuel's father. I told you earlier that my research in 2023 pointed to a matter that old Nathan's son John was almost surely the oldest child in that family, not Samuel. So we have John, named for the grandfather. Let's come back to this. I want you to look at this name here. Let me enlarge it so you can see it well. Would you have stumbled over the way his name appears in this record? Would you recognize that it was Gann, or think it couldn't possibly be Gann because the G is not identical to the two G's to the left of it? As researchers, we encounter numerous instances with handwritten records. Have you ever made a goof with your own handwriting? Sometimes other people did too, right? We're not the only ones who have done that. The capital G in John's name is a kind of overwrite. There are actually two G's here, and I don't think I can trace it with my laser pointer effectively, but I can show it to you on paper. And I can explain why it's made the way it is. The Edmund Jennings, who was so thorough, and he became governor later, attempted an initial G here, that has the descender that looks just like these G's, no problem. But he flubbed the top of it. He flubbed it up there. So what he did, he made a different style G right next to it. He didn't strike it out, and there's a reason for that. He made a more modern typescript G that resembles this one here much more, except he put a real bulbous side on the back of the loop. And he brought the descender down, but he hooked it. He didn't want two descenders looking exactly alike. He wanted to distinguish that these are two G's side by side. Now, why didn't he strike it? Strike it means mark through it. This is a land patent. This is the most important record of early America that anybody could ever have in their own name. If someone produced the patent later and it had a strike through, it would have been thought to possibly be altered, that it was a forgery, that it was wrong. So Edmund Jennings, because he was a careful man and he knew the importance of this record, he didn't strike through, so therefore it would never be considered to be a counterfeit. Can you see this a little better?
Yes.
There is the top loop, but he flubbed that, but he brought the descender down correctly. He realized he flubbed it. He wrote the next G right next to it. He made the loop here, just like you see over here. made the loop, came down, but he made a really big loop right there, and came down and hooked it to make the top of this look more like this, but not confuse the descender of this with the descender of this, to keep from making the record look like a counterfeit, to ensure that those F's would never be questioned about those 1,000 acres that they received for transporting 20 people to Virginia in 1700 on a ship they owned, captained by a captain from their home county, Kent, England. You heard me quote Elizabeth Shone Mills earlier today. She cautions about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you judge this record on the basis of this one item here, that it didn't resemble 100% these G's over here, you'd be throwing the baby out with the bathwater. You'd be putting the baby into the Atlantic Ocean, is what you would have done. We don't want to do that. We want to look at every single clue that there is in a record. So what Elizabeth Shone Mills says is we take note of the flaws in a record and work with the possibilities that exist. So I've explained the flaws in this record, and I've explained why Edmund Jennings, careful, did not strike this out. He made two G's side by side, so it could be explained later. If you're wondering, let me go back, about this long leader here that crosses through to the A and the N, and that is definitely an A and an N. You're not going to see any other letter there except A and N. If you're wondering about that long leader, though, I want you to compare to this. Here's that 1703 Richmond County, Virginia record that I first showed you. Look at the long leader on that A. It goes right through that G and Gann. Look at that long leader. It goes right through those two G's in Gann. It was the style of the time. These are not even the same people. This was a clerk, an unnamed clerk. I searched and searched and searched, hoping I could find the name of the clerk so I could show you that this was not Edmund Jennings, but it wasn't. Edmund Jennings was not a regular court clerk. He did hold many different posts, though, in Virginia at the time. So here we have, this is my notes. This is what I do when I research. I take a screenshot, I put the source film on it, the number, I write out the full names of the persons who, in this case, received the patent. I write down the date of the patent. I looked on the previous page because this patent covers 2 pages, and 20 immigrants transported. Now, what does that mean, 20 immigrants? John arrived as a free person. He was never, ever, ever indentured. He was never, ever, ever in bondage. He just agreed to relinquish his 50 acres of head right that he could have claimed for himself in exchange for free passage on basically the neighbor's ship. The Epps were well known. They were known to be safe people in Kent. A lot of people wound up in dangerous circumstances when they immigrated to America if they just took up with anybody willing to transport them, because there were shady people involved too. And sometimes people wound up being indentured and in bondage for 6 and 7 years when they arrived here because of those shady people willing to make a buck for themselves but do no good to them, the others. The Epps weren't that way. And their reputation would have been known in Kent, and John Gann would have grown up knowing that they were safe people. So he arrived as a free man, able to make his own decisions about what he was going to go do in life and where he was going to go. There were 80,000 people in Tidewater, Virginia when he arrived. And most of them that arrived, they got out of there. There were lots of jobs there, but they moved on out. Now here's a record that I used, and there should be, I must have mixed up slides here. You have to go to English records. You have to sometimes go to records outside of America to find records created in America. We have record loss in this country due to a number of reasons, but every record created in colonial Virginia got duplicated by handwriting and sent back to London to the king's agents because the king owned Virginia. It became a royal colony. So in 1957, this man, and I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, he extracted those records in London. And when I went to those records, I found the list of ships entering inwards to Upper District, James River, from the 2nd of July, 1700, to the 25th of March, 1701. Now, the Atlantic has a season for crossing and a season for not crossing, right? So that ship that John Gann was on would have arrived earlier in the year, no later than early fall, right? So we know that his ship, the Nicholson, and here it is, and here's some important information. The Nicholson is described because the king wanted to know everything. It was a square stern, so it looked like a galleon. You know what a Spanish galleon looks like. They were a favored shape of ship because they could hold a lot of cargo. It was a prize, condemned, Virginia, 1698. Prize means it was a captured ship. And it was condemned. That was the legal process by which a captured ship was renamed and given new ownership in Virginia in 1698. In 1697, King William's War had just ended. This French frigate, remember the FFR abbreviation on the patent? This French frigate was captured right at the end of King William's War. It was 110 tons, which means water displacement. It does not mean the weight of the ship. The master of the ship was Ephraim Beard, and the master is the navigator. The captain handles all the other business of the ship, the manifest and, all the rules and regulations. And in some cases, captains were navigators, but not usually. And here are the here are the owners. Here's Francis Epps over here. And we also have William Byrd of Virginia, Esquire. Famous name. We have William Randolph. Famous name. The Epps, one of the daughters, married into the Randolph family. They were building their fortunes. They weren't extraordinarily rich at the time. To buy a ship, they had to pool their money to do it. The list carries over to the top of the next page. And here they owned a sloop also. The sloop were the coastal runners. They're the ones that went up and down the rivers and up and down the Atlantic coast, picking up passengers, picking up goods. They were taxis. And they delivered goods that came in on the big ships to Jamestown. So they had their hands in a couple of these pies of shipping. This record here in the same book proves the patent, the handwritten patent. A list of patents signed in October 1701. This went to London. Here is Charles City County, because that's where the 1,000 acres in the Blackwater Swamp were granted to the 3 Epps. And these Epps, these 20 passengers, are their transports. they're not having to share this with William Byrd and with William Randolph. And here's Francis Epps et al., 1,000 acres. Here is a ship that is very, very much like what John Gann would have sailed on. Well, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to do this, to give you a bigger picture. There we go. That is a square stern frigate, and it is known to be a drawing of the law of use, which is a light frigate. They come in classes with a square stern, which was similar to the one John Gann would have sailed to America. Surprisingly, these ships held a lot more crew than I ever thought. A ship this size could handle 200 to 300 people. Sailors, if they're military, because of all these guns here, these are gun ports, or crew like passengers. I thought maybe I could determine how many passengers came by the number of patents issued from that arrival date of summer of 1700 to the 24th of October, 1701. I can tell you that there were over 100 passengers from England on that ship at the same time that John Gann run. But I can't give you a more complete number than that. Now here's that simple map that I showed you earlier from Roberta's blog. Here's Richmond. So here is, and this is a dumbed down version of the map, but this is the James River. And John arrived on the upper district of the James River, and the river, of course, does actually run up in here in 1700. So he had, and this is a push pin here, when I tried to look up Upper District James River to find out how far above Jamestown it was, I couldn't really pinpoint that, because Upper District James River now means where guys like to canoe and kayak up in the watershed area, where it drains, you know, wilderness area where you can hike and portage and all like that. And something entirely different back in 1700. He did not land at Jamestown. He landed above there, and Turtle City did actually have a port. So I would say that's probably where he landed, because the Epps owned the ship, or they were co-owners, and they lived in this area right here. It would have been closer to their home for them, less distance for them to travel to get home. I was intrigued by this light frigate stuff, so I started looking up. Could I pinpoint, you know, when that ship was captured? Because I know that it was captured, renamed in 1698. Now, Nicholson was the governor in 1698. He was not a popular governor at all. But naming the ship after him could have been to curry favor. The Byrds and the Randolphs were involved with government, and maybe they thought it might do them some good to name drop a little bit, so the ship got named the Nicholson. I know it was captured in 1698, and these two ships were actually dropped from the list. These are French frigates, as a matter of fact, and where their names and where they were built, and the shipbuilders, and this one has sizes. I can't say for sure that this is the ship. Don't know. There's not enough identifying information, but it was sort of intriguing nonetheless. Now, I told you about the ship captain died. News didn't move quickly because things had to be sent, news had to be sent by ship back to England. And this is his widow, Susanna Mundy, in Virginia. Widow of the late Joseph Mundy, but she had to go to prerogative court in Canterbury, because that was the county seat of Kent. merchant ship Nicholson in Virginia. So we have that. Now we do know what happened to the ship because Coldham's book of Complete Immigrants has a record in here. You know, if you're going to make money on a ship, you got to keep that ship moving, right? You got to do just as much shipping as you possibly can to recover your cost and make a profit on that. So they had that ship in the water just as often as they could. So on the 23rd of May in 17, he deposed. This is actually in 1712 he deposed. That in July 1709, when he intended for New England to handle some business that he had, he sent a letter of attorney, power of attorney, sent to New England by the Nicholson, but the ship was taken by the enemy. It was recaptured. What happened in 1709 was one of those interminable new wars between Britain and France had broken out again, and it was called Queen Anne's War. The French saw their ship. They captured it back. And that's the end of this story, and it's our story, and it's John Gann's story, and it's the story of Kent, and it's the story of our DNA that traces all the way back to Kent, England, that I believe shows that our John Gann, who is the father of Samuel Gann, who married Elizabeth Dodson, that John is our immigrant ancestor. Now that doesn't mean that we're not related to some of those other Ganns who came to America, but they're not our direct ancestors. The paper trail points to John Gann being our direct ancestor. The DNA confirms the DNA connection. Thank you.